thank you all for coming to the ARC forum. Hopefully you've had a interesting and fun and informative time, and obviously thank you for sticking around for this session. And if you're flying back today, obviously safe travels, and if it's tomorrow, then or the next day, then enjoy and have a safe travel. So my name is Tim Shea. I'm an analyst here at ARC Research. Been there a little over 9 years, and historically it was focused on the upstream and midstream oil and gas segments, and did some work in aftermarket compressor and turbine monitoring and controls and sort of optimization in that area. And most recently over the last year and a half, looking at robots and drones. And so that's kind of what obviously the focus of our session is, drones empowering automation and inspections. So we'll just, so basically some housekeeping issues. Ideally put your phone on vibrate. Provide feedback on the session, obviously, if you can, on the form app. For updates, this is the last session, so we'll pretty much get lunch boxes after this outside, and then, obviously save your questions and things like that. I'll have some questions at the end through a Slido thing, which earlier I did them in the first slides, but it didn't work the way we thought, so that's a lesson learned. So we'll just get right into it. So what I'm going to be talking about is kind of based on some published and ongoing market intelligence, or studies, if you will, that we've been looking at these markets. We've had Rick Riss, a colleague of mine, has been doing a drone session at our forum for probably the last 3 or 4 years. So he's had some, that was kind of the focus of our efforts. And then we wanted to kind of get into the market a little bit deeper. So we've done studies on drones for the process industries, obviously with oil and gas. I'm working on finishing up one, hopefully at the end of this month, on drone inspection services. Industrial robotics is more the traditional fixed robot you'd see on a automotive plant or something like that. Collaborative robots are kind of like basically the same type of fixed robot, but they're designed to be collaborative in the sense they can work next to a human. They don't need machine safeguarding and fencing and things like that. And there's an interesting one because I had to put a little bit of a distinction in my study, because I was looking at robots that were like the quadrupedal robot from Boston Dynamics, or AnyMall, where there's several quadrupedal robots, but the robots, the collaborative robots now, what they're doing, they're getting pretty creative. They're fixed robots, but they're putting it on an autonomous mobile robot, and you'd see it around a warehouse, and so they've got the arms and it can move around. So that's pretty interesting. And then we had guys in our supply chain team do a mobile warehouse robot study, and then also done a study, as I just mentioned, on the robots for process industry. But the topic pretty much here, I'll talk a little bit about robots just to kind of, because I think it's an interesting topic, and there's kind of a sort of a synergy, as I'll get into a little bit, between those two technologies. But so the drone market, basically the leader is DJI. It's a company out of China. There's a couple of other companies like Parrot and Skydio, and there's a couple of interesting guys working on things called autonomous drone in a box solutions. And basically what that is they're very much a hardened, you'll see on the right-hand side, it's basically an enclosure that's designed to be, weatherproof and things like that. And they can basically open up. The drone can fly a pre-programmed mission on its own, collect the data, whether it's whatever kind of data, maybe visual data, so a camera, it might be a thermal sensor, it could be, a number of different sensors that they may be incorporating. And then it flies itself back into the enclosure, basically lands, and then it recharges. And some of them actually have little robot arms that come out and swap out the batteries, and so some just charge the batteries. Different companies have different approaches, but it's pretty fascinating because you can, at the end of the day, that's where I think the future is going to be. I mean, obviously the FAA and other countries have their own similar organizations that are going to be, impeding that progress. But I think as this technology continues to be proven out to these regulatory agencies, we're going to see increasingly these type of autonomous drones. We don't even, because if you're looking at a pilot, that may cost you $150 an hour. And if you need an inspector or two, so you could be talking $300 or $400 an hour, to run some of these. So eventually, with the FAA and other countries get that all figured out, I think this market is going to see a little bit greater adoption. But the number one reason for any of this stuff is really safety. It's you're trying to keep an employee from climbing up a flare stack that's 200 or 300 feet in the air, or then you're saving the cost of scaffolding and all the time and costs associated with that. So safety is really the number one driver for drones, particularly, and also robotics. COVID-19 kind of accelerated that because companies, were basically for a period of time were locked down. So they had to figure, okay, crap, what do we got to do here? So what can we do? Some of them had drone programs that they kind of maybe had to bring out of the dust, out of the mothballs and really start deploying those, or they had robotics or whatever they had. So it's really it's a safety first driver. But what we're finding out is that with these drones, particularly as they get more and more autonomous, there's a lot more benefits from just safety. And we'll get into that a little bit here. So these are basically just a couple of pictures. Like DJI, I mentioned, is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in a sense, and that's both commercially and consumer with photographers and all these other things. They're a pretty big player. And SenseFly was owned by Parrot. They now over part of Ag Eagle, but they have like sort of that fixed wing, and then there's a sort of a VTOL, which means you can vertically take off, but then it becomes sort of a plane sort of thing. So those are typically for longer distances. Most of these drones, the majority are rotor-based, the battery-based, which limits their performance, to plus or minus 30 minutes. And if you add some payload on there, some sensors and things like that, it gets even less. So that's obviously a gating factor besides the regulatory issues that the FAA and others like it. So these are sort of just conceptually some of the there's different types. You can see some that are like, maybe they have a 6 or 8 foot wingspan, and there's a company that I think it's Raytheon owns them, it's In Situ. They're doing, for military and also pipelines, but they take off and, they're kind of like a little small plane, and they're for longer missions. And most of those are either, gas or powered or, and there's some that are tethered that can actually fly for long distances, so but they obviously have a limitation about how far can you go with a tethered drone. So there's a lot of, different types of form factors and obviously battery technology and regulatory. Those are the two big inhibitors from these things really starting to take off. I'm still I'm not sold yet on all this delivery stuff. I know there's Walmart and these other companies looking at it, but the more I thought about it, I think for high priced, prescription drugs and some other things, I think, because I said, someone just said, what if you got a guy, flying around with a couple of fancy smartphones and some criminal sees that and they knock it out of the sky. And of course, then they can theoretically pick up the phone. So there's a lot of issues that I think that need to be worked out. Obviously, if that takes off, then how are you going to manage all these things? You need there's various things they call unmanned traffic management systems, or UTMs, and there's a bunch of different companies. And of course, I talked to one of these drone guys, and he said, once the FAA gets, lets things get a little bit more open to allow these things, then you got to standardize behind which one of these guys are you going to use. So that's going to take a few years to get that figured out, and we'll see what happens. Applications, obviously, again, I talked about hard to reach areas, and particularly those that are designed for longer. Some of the guys that are like some other Chinese companies, and they're designed to, just do power lines or vegetation or thermal cameraing on the power lines and things like that. And in fact, there's one company in China that's serving like the largest utility. It's like the Chinese utility over there in China, if you took the name of it. But they're, those are, and I think a big area I think that really had good thing is methane. Obviously, methane detection, monitoring, and leak detection to help enable, leak detection and repair and things like that, mitigation. So I think with ESG and sustainability becoming increasingly a real, requirement, I think that you're going to see more people trying to look and see if they can get various types of drone form factors to make that work. Obviously, surveying and mapping is a big application right away. Stockpile measurements, which you'd see in mining or something like that, or pulp and paper. And the interesting thing is that we're seeing increasingly, and we're going to probably hear about that in one of the presentations, about how these drones, when they're so, they're being AI enabled with image processing and 3D scanning and LiDAR and things like that. So they're doing, they're creating and enabling digital twins, which obviously is a pretty hot topic in a lot of different industries. Surveillance and monitoring, like of a plant or right of ways. And I think that's where a lot of the drone and box guys, they've been like Percepto and guys like Air Robotics and some of these other guys, they've, a big application for them is surveillance and monitoring of ports and containers, or a physical refinery, the plant perimeter security and things. And where I see an increasing integration of drones is that a robot guy will say, we autonomous, and then the drone guys will chuck it because their autonomy levels, they're much more mature, let's put it that way. And so they're working together with a lot of these drone guys. I mean, the drone guys are working with the robotics guys to enhance the automation, because what I see is you envision a drone going around surveilling aerially, and then if it'll signal a robot to check out a certain area, hey, this part of the fence has been tampered with or whatever the case may be. So I think there's going to be, in fact, AeroVironment, which is a company that focuses more on the military market from planes and drones, does some industrial stuff, and they acquired a company called Telerob out of Europe. They had these sort of like the tracked industrial robotics, and they're So they're seeing that there's going to be an integration of that. So I think we're going to see that increasingly coming in the future, particularly as the regulations on the drone side open up, and the autonomous operations. So we're going to hear about some of that stuff in one of these presentations. But that's really where that's going to be a big area, because you got all these pilots out there, and they're and let's face it, it's human nature. One pilot may be better than another pilot. So you have inconsistent data quality, collection and issues and things like that. And then you cannot, a drone that's programmed, you can run the same mission every time. And so you're going to get consistency of the data collected. And I think it's going to help in the analysis and the reporting and things like that. So there's a lot of things going on in my mind that I think, it's funny because I was sort of sarcastically joking about all this so-called smart VC money was putting money into these drone companies a few years ago. And I said, well, they're a little bit too early. A lot of these guys lost a lot of money in some of these companies because the market is just, slow to evolve. They haven't covered the oil and gas market for a number of years. I know that you can say you think it's going to happen here, but you always got to kind of put in the reality factor there. It kind of moves a little bit slower than everybody hopes and wishes. But so I think there's going to be there's applications I won't even talk about that are probably going to be found out as people, use these in their applications, and they realize benefit in one little area. Then they say, well, what else can I do? And I think we're going to see an increasing amount of that. So basically, what's the drivers of adoption? We talked about the safety. That's obviously that's the real main reason. We talked about you can really increase the cost and really improve the time of inspections, which obviously has a time and a cost factor. You can increase the number of inspections during a day, because these things could just they just run these things over and over again. You don't have to pay a pilot $150, $200 an hour. If you have a pilot plus you got an inspector, you're looking at probably at least double that. So you're having the automated data collection and analysis, and with some of this, you'll hear about some of the SLAM-based LiDAR. You can get some really high-resolution imaging, which is really fantastic. BVLOS waivers are being, I guess I say expanded, but when I looked at the numbers, I think there was like 4,500 BVLOS waivers applied for at some point in time, and I think the FAA approved like less than 3% of them, and most of them are like some utility guy that says, I want to go do emergency response, and they tend to get it that way, or you have BP in the North Slope of Alaska or something like that. But it's very limited because, they don't want them flying over people. There was, they just started allowing, nighttime flight, but you got to meet certain requirements. So there's a lot of things going on with the FAA, 107. And I was just talking to somebody at Percepto at this drone show I was at back here in Orlando in end of April, and she runs all their regulatory thing. And I said, man, you must be pulling your hair out, because she's got to deal with all these countries. And some of them are more progressive than others. And my impression is that the FAA and Canada and these countries are not one of the progressive. They don't care about adoption. They care about, obviously safety and things like that. So they're working with these guys now. It's been 27 months or 28 months probably by now. And the FAA just released like a 400-page report. And from the FAA's perspective, that was like a monumental thing, that they actually are starting to make progress. So there's a lot of hope that maybe, we'll see, because that's really, in my mind, is the number one inhibitor. And then obviously battery life is probably number two. So basically, there's a lot of advantages. I talked about the drone in the box. I think that's, even DJI came up with its own drone in the box thing. Is really, you just need to work with an enclosure guy, work on some of the comms. And so it's not a really complicated thing to do, but it's really the autonomous operations, and then the high D, as we're going to hear about the 3D scanning and imaging to create the digital twins and all that advanced AI imaging and things. That's where the battle is going to be won, because I think that's where the real value is going to be added. Obviously, we talked about some of the inhibitors, battery life, the visual line of sight requirements for a lot of them. But then if you go BVLOS, you still may need a visual observer, or you may need a chase car or a plane or something like that. So they don't make it easy on you. And those are certainly things that have been sort of impeding a little bit of adoption. But I think that the outlook is bright, again, assuming regulations can continue to sort of hopefully evolve, ideally, hopefully a lot quicker than they are, but that's the way it is. There's already been, all these guys have already been using drones, like BP and Shell, and these guys are already using them in the refineries and things like that already for, again, for the safety reasons. They don't want their guys going up and down these smokestacks and things like that. So there's safety reasons, they're saving time, they're getting better quality data. So there are all those factors that have been driving this adoption. I guess in the interest of time, I'll just keep going. But you can see basically, I think that there could be, a pretty good ramp up over here in the next, it's kind of hard to forecast because I don't really know when the FAA is going to kind of get out of its own way and let things, so it's kind of like I kind of be somewhat conservative. But I think if certain things happen, that curve could go, it could, the acceleration of the curve could be certainly more dramatically in the positive direction. Applications, inspections obviously is a big thing, and there's all kinds of different inspections. Could be visual, it could be using a thermal camera, they could be using acoustic vibration. They could be doing predictive maintenance theoretically, of various types of equipment. Leak detection, I think, is going to be an area that's a big one. I think surveying, mapping, and obviously change or progress detection, monitoring of those things, of projects and things like that. So that's an area I think that people are starting to see. And then surveillance, as I talked about. Maintenance applications, well, that was talking more about robots, but we'll get into that later on. So there's a lot of potentially new applications that, that I haven't even thought about. And I'm saying that's the exciting part is you get an end user that starts to really have some success with these things, and then they can come up with things that, some people didn't even think about. So that's really encouraging. I'll just touch a little bit about robots because I think even though this is about drones, there's still a lot of synergy because they're really what they're trying to do is enable autonomous operations. And that's what a lot of our owner-operated clients are moving towards. I mean, they come to us and they say, we're working on our autonomous roadmap right now, and they want to know about drones and robots. And I think you should be aware there's different form factors. I mean, obviously the quadrupedal are kind of the wheeled and tracked ones on the right. There's one, the SMP Robotics has a wheeled, four-wheeled thing that they use to go around, and they do that a lot for surveillance of facilities and things, but they have some set up for leak detection. And, and there's also kinds of form factors like snakes. They go around and they can go inside tanks and things like, inside the pipes and things like that. So there's a lot of different form factors. I think I didn't put any bipedal up here because there's none that I'm really aware of that's commercialized. There's a company called Singularity.ai that's got a really a humanoid looking thing. But I think that they're still very much in the sort of a development stage, and they might focus more on the commercial market initially. But I think there's actually a company called Unitree, which has as Unitree and Ghost Robotics. Those are two other lower cost, which is going to be a critical factor here. Cost and interruptibility of these. So users don't want to be locked into. So I think Boston Dynamics and other companies like that were smart to open up their APIs because they're building an ecosystem of companies. They're working with IBM and a whole bunch of other companies on sensors and edge computing and how to get the data into the cloud. So there's a lot of that activity, which is really exciting. And then the guy at Boston Dynamics basically told us that we look at this as kind of a mobile inspection platform. We want everybody to do what they can with this thing because they know that that's going to really expand the adoption. I hope that Hyundai's backing and will be able to help them lower costs on the manufacturing side. And then this is a little bit about the robots. Again, it goes back to safety. But with a robot, you don't have the FAA to worry about, so you have a little bit more of a flexibility. But if you're going, they have to test these things on platforms, because the stairs sometimes, if you try to use a wheeled or a tracked device in some of these things, it just doesn't work. The tracks fall apart, they break. The quadrupedal guys, one of the issues they had on one of the platforms, it was very windy, so they needed to, had a certain kind of wind shielding capability. How does it, handle those things? But they're getting much more agile and mobile. I mean, they can fall over and then get themselves back up. It's pretty interesting. You can go to I saw one of these shows, and they just, they walk around, they come up to you, and they sense that you're there. They walk around you. It's really, I think that's going to be really an exciting area to see that. A lot of the same things. And battery life is obviously investments. These Boston Dynamics one, if you get an enterprise model without any sensors, it's probably at least $150,000. So it's, and that's, I mean, they told me that initially they think nuclear power stations, because there's obviously radiation. You don't want people to get in there. So those substations where they're highly electrified, those are areas where there's a big safety issue. And that's an easy one because that's where they see the value. But I think hopefully by then they can get the cost down, because Unitree, I think that one in China is like $10,000. It's obviously a lot more base model, and but even the Ghost Robotics is like less than $50,000. And that's where the pricing needs to go, because if you want to get mass scale adoption, you've got to be. And I thought it was interesting, this company called X Robotics, they're actually working with Yokogawa. Yokogawa is kind of like their systems integrator. They're the robot guys, and they're working with a software company called Energy Robotics, and they do a lot of interesting things with the cloud and things like that. But X Robotics basically has a robot as a service. I call it a RAS. And their model is not just the safety, but they come out and said, look, our base model is 35,000 euro. They're a European company. And they worked it out based on the availability of the robot. It works out to be like 12 euro an hour. So they're really going at that. This is cost competitive. It's not just a safety issue. I thought that was pretty smart. I think that, and I think, again, it's the adoption, because these guys will take it in the field, and rightly so. They test it for a year or two before they got to prove it out. They want to make sure they can't take a chance that this thing is not going to work as it's supposed to. So that's, but I really think in my gut that especially with any robotics, just come out with an ATEX certified. I think it's zone 1. So that's really going to help with a lot of these, refineries and, obviously with explosive environments and things like that. And I think someone asked me the other night about, have you seen any of these drones that are ATEX certified? And I said, no, but I'm hoping somebody's working on them. I think they're a little bit more complex to do than a robot, but I think that hopefully that'll be something, because I think that's another issue that people worry about is obviously, in hazardous environments. Obviously, like anything else we've talked about, the need for ecosystem partners is tremendous, especially if you're a drone manufacturer. Most of these guys don't make their own sensors or cameras, so they're partnering up with people left and right. And then a lot of these guys don't have the software capability. So there's companies that'll be developing the software platforms, not just for the autonomy, but also like Percepto's got its autonomous inspection and monitoring. They call it AIM platform, and there's a Precision Hawk and some of these other guys have these software platforms that are really geared for. Some of them focus on just utilities, some of them focus on oil and gas. So they're really trying to build these platforms because they realize that the drone is really the hardware. It's what you can add to it, the software, the sensors. That's where the real value, the juice is going to be. But I think that you'll see a lot of partnerships. We're going to hear about, drone service providers are playing a huge role because we have a lot of large owner operators, and some of them have to, in certain countries, they're forced to work. Like in the Middle East, if you want to work in, UAE, I talked to the guy at Falcon Eye Drones, Feds. They basically have a corner in that market because no one else can fly drones there. So he told me, he sort of explained to me about the economics of the American market. There's a lot of drone service providers here. It's a little more cost competitive. Like he can charge what he charges in the Middle East. He got no competition. So it's obviously, it's certainly, but that company got bought by Aerodyne. Aerodyne's the big service provider in drones. And there's another couple of other guys like Terra Drone, and there's a few others, but but that's a very localized, regionalized market, and I'm interested to see if they can scale that up. Obviously they're buying companies in Australia because they realize if they want to get global, they have to, you got to have a global presence. So this is kind of a busy slide. I probably should have tried to pare it down, but it talks a lot about different applications and just the real need to have partnerships. So if you're in this market, or you're looking at it, or if you're an operator or an end user, reach out to these different folks, because you're going to need, particularly on the robotics side, you're going to probably need an integrator like a Yokogawa or someone like that's going to help, integrate all this together. So that's a key thing. Oh, here we go. If you want to take this little survey, someone's already filled it out, I guess, but are you currently testing or deploying drones? So we're just trying to get a sense of the audience. How many folks are here are, not just thinking about it, but are they actually testing or deploying these? And then there's a few others we'll ask about, but we'll take a couple of seconds here just to see if anybody wants to. I guess you scan the QR code, then a link comes up, and then you can say yes or no, and then there's 2 or 3 other questions that. So there we go. We're getting some. Wow, it's a higher number than I thought. Maybe. I don't know if it's just we get a small sample or that's. But it's interesting to see because I think there's been. A lot written about drones, and I really do think that there is value there, and I think that there's probably 10 or 12 companies that are working with the FAA to try to work with what they call a type certification. So a BVOS waiver is a very specific to a specific mission. That's it. You're only from here to there. You want to do something else, you got to get another waiver. So they're trying to work on something called a type certification, which will open it up across a model. So if DJI has a Maverick 600 or whatever model it is, if they can prove out that drone to the FAA, that drone can fly beyond visual line of sight across all missions. And unless they make material changes to the drone, I think my understanding is then that's when they have to recertify. But that's still under development, so it'll be interesting to see. But that's a pretty good number, right? I thought the fact that there's 40% here, people, that's better than I thought. So that's great. We have another question here. If yes, for which applications or operational areas are you testing or deploying drones? Obviously, I think a big one is probably inspections and surveying and monitoring. And when I say stockpile measurement, I'm talking about they fly over a mine and they can measure the surface, so they can get the measurements of the mine. It could be pulp and paper. Or I think leak detection will be one, particularly the ones that are designed for the longer duration flights that have more of a fixed wing one that can fly for several hours. And because it's if you're looking at a rotor drone, you're flying up and down missions. And if it's autonomous, it's not as much of a challenge. But if you're paying a pilot or an inspector, you're paying for their time. It's, you want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So not surprisingly, inspections is the big one. We'll give that a few more seconds here. So I've been talking a little longer than I hoped. But anyways, that just gives you an idea as to what some of the applications, and then if you're not using them, are you looking at them at all in the next 12 months, year or two? I kind of thought if you're not looking at it basically beyond 2 years, then it's almost like a no or never. But it would be interesting to see. That means you might be looking at them. I would not surprising. Don't know is a high answer. So I don't freak to those to the final results. Like, are they going to be baked in at some point, or is that, I don't know how that works in terms of. Okay, but if someone sees the presentation later on, they'll be able to see those results or not. I don't know how that works. Okay, all right. Well, I want to get the chance for these other speakers to. So I want to thank you very much, and I'll first call up Drew. Let's hear from Drew Talley here from Aerial Production Services. Thank you.